All right, we're live for another episode of the Jude 3 Project podcast. As always, I'm your host, Elisa Fields, the founder of the Jude 3 Project. And today I'm joined by a very special guest who's no stranger to the Jude 3 Project podcast. I think he's been on this will be his third time. Well, fourth if you count the moderating of Courageous Conversations. BJ Thompson, welcome, BJ.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today. How you doing today, Lisa?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well.
For those who haven't seen your past episodes, can you just give them a little bit about who you are?
Absolutely. My name is BJ Thompson. I'm a Dallas native, not a Cowboy fan or native or hater. Um, I also serve as a director of an organization called Build a Better Us, which is very specific to growing people along the spectrum, whether you're in a relationship or whether you're single, so that you ultimately become a healthy person or a healthy couple. And also, I live in Atlanta, Georgia, with my wife and children. My wife and I have been married for 15 years this year, and we have three children, 13, 9, and 7. So my life is full, and I'm just glad to be here with you today.
That's awesome. So you're a practitioner. A lot of times we see people on social media talking about relationships when they're not necessarily in one.
Yeah,
You need long lasting. So you got receipts.
yeah, I do, and I got a lot of stress. I just started getting gray hairs this year. Stuff that I do. So absolutely,
So it's
absolutely.
good to have somebody with receipts to talk about what we're going to talk about today. We want to do a special Valentine's Day tribute, not tribute episode, talking about Black love in the church and how it can be a type of apologetic because we know that when we talk about Christ and the church, it's also a connection to marriage. And so a lot of people haven't seen a lot of healthy marriages, so they don't have a point of reference even for that passage to make the connection. So how, BJ, do you think we can use marriage, love, family as an apologetic, especially in the Black context?
Absolutely. I mean, this whole idea of relationship. Robert Zacharias has this line. He says that the greatest apologetic isn't intellectual assent; it's love. And so when you start talking about the whole notion of family, it's within a context of family that we first experience love. It's not in the context of romantic relationships. And so if we really want to see what it looks like to experience God, relationships hold for us this sometimes this unspoken joy inside of us that we get to see love experience from person to person. So say that the family really is key because it's something that you can experience, it's something that we all can relate to, and it's something that God designed in order to be a picture of his relationship with us. And so no, marriage and family is literally one of the first institutions that we see God using to communicate to the world his presence and how he's going to ultimately redeem it. So no, I think it's very important.
Mhm. And I think it's important, as I was saying before, because of our context in the Black communities where there's a lot of broken families. Um,
Absolutely.
how have you been able to? Why is this so important as a ministry for you? Because I know it has a lot to do with you seeing and experiencing brokenness with families and you wanting to build healthy families for our community specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that the reason why it's important for me, partly and very honestly, is because of the first 5 years of my marriage and relationship. When I look back on the initial years of my relationship, though we had sincere love for one another, it was very difficult. It felt like there was this an impossible thing of trying to overcome all of your selfishness, all of your lack of information, all of the obstacles that really just kind of came up after we said I do. And so, what I would say is the reason why it's a passion is because I recognize that it wasn't just the issue that we were facing, that it was an issue that many people across the world were facing at the same time. And so I think it's important for us to consider the building of families, what we call build a better us, because families ultimately shape society. And if you don't have healthy cultures of family or even just proactive care, you find yourself always on the back end of trying to help people. And it ultimately impacts children, that impacts grandchildren, which impacts cities, which impacts communities everywhere. And so, no, it's absolutely an important thing for us. I think one thing, just to kind of make a little side note for us, is there was a report that came out in 1964 called the Moynihan Report. And the
Mhm.
Moynihan Report, if you haven't read it, was kind of a State of the Union report, came from the government. And it talked about all of the post-traumatic stress and brokenness that had occurred through the transatlantic slave trade, through Jim Crow and segregation. But I think, and then what it did was it gave this recommendation. It said that family has to be restored within the Black community because as a nation, we had done things, atrocious acts that actually unhinged the family and separated the family. So yeah, that's absolutely why it's one of my passions.
Mhm. And I know we've talked about this several times before, the obstacles in the Black community because of the trauma and the things systemically that have been done to separate
Mm-hmm.
and destroy the Black family. You look
Absolutely.
at the mass incarceration, which takes a lot of African American men out of the dating pool, and how that affects the formation of Black families. And so,
Absolutely.
you know, in white evangelical context, there's a push for families, but in the Black context, there's an obstacle because of the systematic systems in place that hinder the Black family. So there was slavery and the transatlantic slave trade and all of that stuff that
Mm-hmm.
broke up families, and then there's a perpetuation of it. So some people want to push, for Black families without understanding the obstacles to families in this generation. Do you think?
Absolutely, no, absolutely. I totally agree. So I think part of the way that you care for families is by knowing those obstacles, right?
Mhm.
Too oftentimes we want to get past that trauma because it's so painful. It is very difficult to talk about the fact that we own human beings as property and as animals for 300 years. It's very difficult to say as a society we affirm this white superiority and this second class citizen. It is very difficult to talk about this. It's very difficult to talk about the passing of laws that created disproportionate mass incarceration for people of color. But I think if you avoid those things as we're having pro-life talks, as we're having the restoration of family talks, what you end up finding yourself doing is skirting over the issues that would be systematic to the actual conditions and specific families, as opposed to symptomatic. Symptomatic would be single parent home. Symptomatic would be mass incarceration. Symptomatic would be tons of children who go in and out of the system because they don't have a father. That's symptomatic. Systematic is, as a society, we created those things. And so what I would say is when it comes to this idea of recognizing those realities, the realities for us have to be faced. But the problem is they have to be faced with courage because of the amount of trauma that kind of just comes, it's birthed forth out of this idea of, man, I don't really like to deal with this pain. I don't want to know what happened. I just want to move forward and be honest. It's kind of what you're seeing now in some of the policies and the things that are coming out of the government, that there's some things that are not lining up, and there's a lot of senators and congressmen saying, well, we just want to move forward, right? But until you deal with what's behind you, you can't actually move forward in a healthy way. So no, I think you're absolutely spot on when it comes to thinking about how do we think about this in a clear, objective way that gives credit but doesn't necessarily characterize how we care moving forward. So
Mhm.
great question.
Yeah. And I think that trauma also hinders people from in our generation wanting to pursue marriage
Absolutely.
because they're dealing with trauma. How do you help? I know you counsel a lot of couples, single
I do.
and
I'm stressed out. I'm stressed out from it. Go ahead. Very stressed out from it.
you tell me that every time I ask you about you
I do.
counseling couples.
They're stressful. I mean, it's a lot of issues. It's very, very stressful. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And there's a lot on the line. Go ahead.
Mhm. How do you help people who are single that are dating and say, you know what, I just can't make that step for marriage? I know it is paralyzing for a lot of men out there, and they're really afraid because of the trauma they experience, not having somebody to show them what it looks like. How do you help them navigate through that space?
Absolutely. So I think that for us, we recognize that there was a gap. And the gap being that there was not a clear objective, tangible way to see marriage up close. And so part of the reason why we started Build a Better Us was to create this presence where people could see and experience and touch these real live relationships. When, one of my mentors, I love this line. He says this: you'll only be what you see, you'll only become what you behold, right? And
Mhm.
so I think that a lot of times we think that just the intellectual understanding of a relationship is sufficient, when in reality, we really imprint our understanding on society, our understanding on relationships, based off this idea of what we see and what we have access to, right? And so what we've done is we try to create access to couples and access to marriages via small groups, via intimate dinners, via just opening up your home and teaching and training engaged and married couples to actually be intentional about their relationship and open it up to others. And so part of the way that we've done it is we try to give access to singles, right? The other thing I would say is this: via preparation, I think it's just real talk. It's giving people the space to process. It's giving them the opportunity to say that hurt me. I grew up in this type of background. I grew up this type of perspective. And I think get everything on the table so that as we're dealing with it, we kind of know who you are, why you're doing what you're doing, and what are the things that you learn from your parents? What are the things you feel like you learn from the society, so that we can kind of come alongside you and kind of correct the things that are off, but then also affirm the things that are also on point, that are really healthy. And so what I found is that in a lot of ways, you become a marriage mentor.
Mhm.
You really step up into a space that you're helping people, but as you help people, you're helping yourself. And that's kind of the irony of it all, is that the more you open, the more you share, the more you love, the more you're actually helping yourself, and you're not necessarily just helping the person that you're serving. So,
Mhm.
yeah,
And I think that's really what good how you were talking about. You give people access to couples, because in
absolutely.
a world where we have quote unquote access through social media to couples, we often
That's not access, Lisa. That's
yeah,
not. Got you.
we have their highlight reel, which is what I was about to say. We have access to their highlights, and so people have this image of relationships that's not always good. Hashtag relationship goals. Last year, Nicki Minaj and Meek Mills was a lot of people relationship goals, and now they're not together anymore. So, we hashtag relationship goals on pictures or couples that look cute, and then people have expectations for relationships because they haven't had access to real people doing day-to-day life. So I think that's what you're doing is really important, especially for
Abs-
the culture.
Absolutely.
How do you find that social media is kind of hindering people's or relationship?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So I would say that social media, in a lot of ways, creates. We see in social media, you and your mate, holding hands. We see in social media you and your wife or spouse going on vacations, but we don't get to see the things that are challenging to you. Maybe a miscarriage, maybe the fact that you guys are having infidelity issues, maybe the fact that you are having, situations that are going on. And so I think that the part of the issue, the challenge, I wouldn't say it's because I don't think it's all bad, right? I think that part of the issue is good because you get to see love, and it stirs within you a desire to want to pursue and want to have something. So I don't think it's all bad, right? I think for the first time, we actually get to see couples
Mhm.
and get to actually get visual images of who they are and what they're doing. I think what's challenging is that you don't get the comprehensive perspective of what that couple entails. And so my wife and I, we hold hands. She's always kissing my face. It's all kind of stuff that's happening there, right? But we have to go through they call it the tunnel of chaos. And we have to work through issues all the time. And we have to talk through stuff. And we have to humble ourselves. And we have to come to places of reconciliation and say, I'm sorry. And I think because of social media, You don't get to see those things. You get to see the fact that we hug, hold hands, and the things that we would want you to see. We don't get to see the other elements of it. And so what I would say is, for those of us who are watching, the best advice I would give someone is get yourself around the person in real time, right? I think that's the thing that's happened. Denzel Washington has been really harping on this idea of being present, being informed, and that if you really want to see change in your life, you have to get yourself out of just the news feed and put yourself in a place where you can live the real in time kind of life. And so I would just say it's ugly and it's pretty. It's both at the same time. And that's what you want. You want people who can model out both what's ugly and pretty so that you can get a real good understanding of what that looks like. So, yeah, great question.
And something else that I know you do that I think is important, and I heard you say this, I think in the clip, you kind of you encourage people to do marriage in community, because there's a in our community in just the U.S. it's kind of like me, my four, no more. You don't know what's going on in my house, and you share how that kind of sometimes hinders people from growth and development. And so you kind of encourage couples to be open with other couples. Now, you're not going to tell all your business, but you need somebody else that's
in your business.
Yeah, in your business to help you if your business is a mess.
Yeah.
Why do you encourage people to do that, Shalane?
Yeah, so we encourage people to do that so that they can have a culture of transparency. You know, I think the difficult thing about having a culture of transparency is that you have to be humble in order to do it, right? Like, one of the issues that we deal with is the fact that people struggle to project. All we want to do is project what it looks like to look at a certain person and to engage in a way that you only want to be perceived. And the problem with perception is that you only want to be perceived in the way that you want to be known. And so what you do when you stop projecting and you're very honest about who you are and what this means, it ultimately means this is that now you are your full self, right? And so what I would say is this whole idea of not projecting allows you to be able to be an authentic you. And that's what people really enjoy, right? People enjoy when we're authentic. They don't enjoy when we are trying to create this mirage of what it looks like to be us. And so what I would say is part of the dilemma that we face is fighting the desire to want to pursue this whole thing of looking a certain way. But when you are the authentic you, it allows you to be able to say, you know what? I'm broken. I need love. I need people I can trust. I need people who will encourage me, but I also have something to offer. And so what I would say is this whole idea of being the authentic you allows you to do that. And sadly and unfortunately, most of us don't even have a space to be able to do that, right? It's really one of the greater challenges is that we don't have the space as a couple to create the authentic self, because the authentic self is very tension. There's a lot of tension involved in it, right? So yeah, that's what I would say. I would say that the projection of self is a struggle, but if you can find one or two couples who can help you navigate through this whole thing, it will allow you to become more of who you are without having to project who you necessarily want to be. So, absolutely.
And I think that's helpful for not only married people, but singles as well. Not projecting just in community, in church spaces, this whole concept of projecting perfection or projecting,
absolutely,
this idea of who you are. Yeah, we post our devotionals. Yeah, we post different things about our close walk with God. But how does that look practically? What obstacles or challenges are we facing? Do we have safe people to address those issues that could call us out on our mess, or that know even, because a lot of people, when stuff comes out about them, it's not something that's new, but it's new to everybody because they've concealed it.
True.
And so
True.
people are caught off guard because we don't have relationships with people that really know us intimately. So I think that's important to develop that skill in singleness, so it'll be able to be transferred into marriage. When we talk about like what are the obstacles for couples, many times when they say that finances is the number one thing that breaks up couples, but would you agree that's the number one thing, or would you say it would be something different?
Oh, I don't agree. I don't agree that it is finances that breaks up couples. I think it's pride that breaks up couples,
Mm.
right? Finance is a symptom, not the actual root of the process, right? Typically finances is always connected to trust and how you trust an individual and whether you trust the person that you're married to. And if you don't have that foundation of, I believe you, I trust you, I love you, then finances becomes a greater issue than what it actually becomes, right? And so what I would say is when we talk about this whole thing of root versus symptom, that you need to start investigating the whole idea of root. And this root for us has to be this whole idea of saying, you know what, I'm wrestling through what it looks like to love you in a meaningful way, to give you my trust, to give you my faith, to say I believe in this marriage, to say I'm committed to this thing. But the issue isn't necessarily finances. Finances is just a symptom of this thing. And so I, in the long term, I've already challenged the whole idea of saying, you know what? We don't have the finances as the primary thing. The real primary thing is, I don't necessarily know whether or not you're committed to this thing. Are you committed to this marriage? Do you believe that God wants us to be married? Are you wrestling through this whole idea that says, you know what? We're committed for life and we are going to wrestle through whatever comes our way? Or are you saying, as soon as certain things come into the picture, I'm going to step back, I'm going to reevaluate, and I'm going to respond whether or not this thing is a good thing. And so what I would say is finances is just a symptom. It's not the root of what we are. And if we're going to really get to the root of who we are, it really means that we go, how is my relationship with the Lord? What does it look like? Do I really believe that he's good? Do I really believe that he's going to care for me? Do I really believe that he's going to help us endure through this thing? And if I do believe that, then now I have to wrestle with you through that thing, because that's ultimately what's going to carry us, not whether or not we have our finances on point. So I don't necessarily believe that those things are the outcome. I believe they're just a symptom of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I think that's good. I was asking one of my married friends, what did if she had a question she thought I should ask you today, and you kind of tied her question she had, and what one of the things was, how do you deal with this idea of always wanting to leave? Because I guess going through marriages, it gets hard, and you're always kind of looking for that exit door, or what is just enough that gives me where God will say, well, you know, I get it. You could go. You could peace out. And so for some people, that's adultery. For some
Yeah.
people, it's not. How would you deal with that question?
Yeah. I mean, you asking to leave. Really, what that means at that point is that you're looking for the out. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're trusting the covenant commitment. One of the things I love, there's a book called This Momentary Marriage by John Piper. And I love the fact that he hyper emphasizes the idea of covenant commitment. That is not just me and you in this covenant, it's you and I and the Lord in this covenant, right? And I think that it's important for us to remember that, because sometimes we think that this is just kind of a super reflection of a boyfriend and girlfriend. This is not the expression of you and I and God kind of in this covenant relationship. And so the first thing is, I think we all need to settle in our minds is, it's you and I plus the Lord in this marriage. And so that's the first thing, is that one, I need to know that. Two, if that's the case, now I need to deal with my own immaturity, right? Because too oftentimes we want to deal with the person that's next to us. We want to deal with our mate. We want to point out their issues. We want to help them move forward. And we want to make sure that they know that what they're doing is not consistent with where we're trying to go. When the reality is, what I need to do is I need to check myself. I need to figure out who I am. I need to figure out where I'm falling short. I need to figure out what it looks like for me to be healthy in the season, what it means to be focused in the season, what it means to be intentional in this season for my own health and growth. Because the more I can do that, the more I can bring that type of health to my mate, right? And so what I would tell a person that's in a position of, when is it time for me to leave? I would say, you focus on you. You focus on what it looks like for you to grow in the season. You focus on what it looks like for you to mature in the season. You focus on what it looks like for you to commune with the Lord in the season. And to take that growth as God is showing to you, and you take that, whatever that is, and you bring that back to the marriage. Because if you can't bring it back to the marriage, ultimately, that's the thing that causes us to suffer, right? Is that we're not changing, and therefore we're not able to bring a new us to the situation in this equation. So what I would say is, it's not necessarily about your mate. It's more about you and how you are maturely communing to the Lord above. So, Good question.
This is my last marriage question. Then we're gonna shift gears to the single part. Do you think love love is enough to keep a marriage together?
Say it again.
Do you think love is enough to keep a marriage together?
No. I think mature love is enough to keep a marriage together. Commitment keeps a marriage together.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be commitment. You have to be committed first before you feel a feeling of love. And if you don't know what mature commitment looks like, then love won't be enough. You have to determine in your heart of hearts that you are committed to this thing. You cannot allow the feeling of love to dictate what the commitment is. So what I would say for many people who are struggling, who are wrestling, who want to see change within a relationship, is that you have to start with the commitment, because the commitment dictates the intimacy, and the intimacy is what we call love. And if you allow yourself to endure within a mature commitment, now you have the groundwork to be able to say, man, I'm committed no matter whatever comes up, right? And we'll wrestle through whatever comes up. If you don't have that, now you're dictating the feeling to be the thing. It's like my kids. Right, my children are amazing. They're funny, but sometimes they're crazy, right? They're breaking stuff. They're doing stuff that they shouldn't. They're causing me grief. They're causing me pain. But the thing that allows me to endure is the fact that I'm committed to them, and they're not going anywhere. And I love them to death, right? And this is what I'm saying. What happens in a marriage is that you are voluntarily saying, I love you and I'm committed to you. And that commitment allows me to say, I'm going to wrestle with you through those things. And without that commitment, I found myself only at the mercy of what I feel. And what I feel, Lisa, the problem with what I feel is, what I feel changes from day to day. It changes from moment to moment, right? So sometimes I feel like I really love my wife and I'm just so enamored by her. But then there's other moments where I feel like I don't like her and I don't want to be around her. And I'm not really like excited about what she has to offer in that moment. And if I depend on that feeling, it causes me to step away from her, and it diminishes it diminishes our intimacy. But when I'm reminded of that commitment, the commitment says that no matter what she does, I'm committed to her and we're going to endure. And so what I would say is, if you don't have the healthy sense of commitment to that person, it doesn't matter how much you love them or how much you say you love them, because ultimately that will fade because it can't mature. And love only matures within the ground of work of commitment. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. And that I always say that unconditional love is on the other side of forgiveness and reconciliation. So until you
Absolutely.
get to that, until you cross the forgiveness and reconciliation part, you only have a conditional sense of love. Um, for those who are single that are listening to this, I think something that we've discussed before several times is the importance of cultivating unconditional love in platonic friendships to prepare you for romantic relationships or marriage going forward. And I was watching an interview of a show talking about him reconciling with Craig, and he said something interesting. We have a healthy kind of we focus on our relationships in marriage, but we don't spend enough energy on how we should treat our friends, platonic friendships, and so that gives us an imbalance in Christian community.
Well,
Why do you think that's important for us to cultivate those relationships in singleness, and be able to commit to people in the body of Christ, even in our own families outside of the marriage relationship?
yeah. No, I mean, we discredit what we're doing in the platonic realm and how it affects our romantic relationships. And we don't believe that how we practice is how we play. And so what I would say is, in a lot of ways, if you don't see the connection between how you treat your friends will be how you treat your spouse, then you will ultimately carry over baggage of unresolved issues into your romantic relationships. And so I love the fact that show talked about how for the first time he recognized the need for us to engage, reconcile, confront different things within our own platonic relationships. And that gave him the power to take that same mindset and to apply it to his marriage, apply it to his business, apply it to different things. And so I think we lack the understanding of what continuity does for us. And continuity allows us to see that what we do in different realms literally carries on. So if you don't have integrity in your business, you won't have integrity in your personal life. If you don't have consistency in your, with your children, it's gonna be struggle to have consistency in your work life. And it's really what it is. It's just this whole idea that this is my character and this is who I am. This is not something I do when I cut and when I flip the switch, right? And so I love the fact that show talked about his platonic relationships, that he had to start applying those things, not just when he flipped the switch, but he had to apply those things in his platonic relationships. And so it's very important that if you have issues that come up with your roommate, that you resolve those issues, that you talk very, honestly, you talk with humility, you talk with a lot of concern, but ultimately you recognize that if I don't resolve this thing, then I'm gonna find myself in a situation down the road where I'm having an unreconciled relationship that will not allow me to move forward. And I think if you don't practice that enough in singleness, it's going to be a struggle to practice that when you have a lot more on the line, right? And so it's essentially what Jesus said when he talked about the parable of the talents. And he talked about this idea that if you can't steward one gift well, then if I gave you 3 or 5 gifts, then you wouldn't be able to ultimately steward those things in the same way. And so it's the same exact thing, is that if you can't steward your roommate situation, you're not going to be able to steward another situation that says there's much more on the line and at stake. So absolutely.
Mhm. One of the things you shared before we started recording was you think it's important for uh, Christians of the opposite sex in friendship relationships to be able to show love that's not necessarily romantic, but that
Absolutely.
the other person in just friendships. And I think that's important because I've talked to you about this, that sometimes Christian men, single men, can be very interesting and in their interactions.
What does that mean, Lisa? What do you mean interesting? What do you mean? What do you mean by
It seems
that?
to be they not know how to interact in just platonic realms without, it's like an emphasis on I gotta stay 10 feet away from you, and it's like, hey, we're just trying to be friends and not romantic. I've heard that from a lot of my Christian sisters and experienced it myself, where it's kind of like Christian men sometimes can be very weird, more weird I mean, and dudes that are unchurched or non-Christians can be cool around women that they're friends with, but then sometimes Christian dudes just get real weird. Like, oh my gosh, I don't want to fall. It's like, dude, I just said hello. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's an
Yeah.
imbalance and not knowing how to interact, and it gets kind of strange. You like, so how do you think that Christian men and Christian women should interact as friends, and what are healthy ways they can affirm each other without it being necessarily romantic?
Yeah. I mean, I shared this before with you. I think that we starve one another of healthy affirmation. It is very difficult to be affirmed in that community because you don't want to be mistaken. You don't want somebody to believe something about you that you're not intending to give off. And because of it, we find ourselves in situations where we either step away from it or we over engage in a situation. And I think that what we have to fight to do is to give you the dignity, the honor, and the respect for who you are and the value that you possess in a way that does not is not necessarily romantic, right? Because when you starve people of something, right? Let's just say, I went on a fast for like 7 days. And I remember after the seventh day in eating for the first time, the first meal that I had was the most amazing meal that I ever had in my life, right? And it was like a bowl of soup. Um, literally, this Campbell soup was the best soup I ever had in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was because simply, it wasn't necessarily that it was the best meal.
Mm-hmm.
It was because I was being so deprived of nourishment
Mm-hmm.
that the first thing I got was overwhelming. It was like literally the best bowl of soup I ever had in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I don't think we credit enough in our own relationships, is that when you starve somebody of something, that the first sign of what they get literally is the best thing they ever gotten in their life. And I think the same thing with the body of Christ is that if you can't affirm your sisters and their brothers and their dignity and their beauty and their characteristics, then what you find yourself doing is starving them of healthy affirmation. And then you make them vulnerable to predators. You make them vulnerable to people with low character. You make them vulnerable to people who with bad intentions. You make them very vulnerable because the first sign that they get of that thing now is the best thing that they ever had, right? And so what I would say is, as single men and women, specifically within the body of Christ, you have to make it a regular practice of affirming the dignity and worth of the people you're around. Otherwise, the moment they get a situation of, girl, you're beautiful, guy, I really appreciate you, you're a great guy. Now it's like they've been starving for so long. That's the best thing that they've had.
Mm-hmm.
And they can find themselves accessible to a relationship or susceptible to a relationship that they never should have been in, simply because the people around them had not been intentional in the way that they should have been. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's what I would say.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important, even with male and female relationships, to remember that things look different in our generation. One of the things my friend always talks about is the fact that, there are more women who are in leadership and in managing positions, leading organizations.
Absolutely.
And so if you haven't learned how to interact with women outside of romantic relationships, it's going to be very difficult for you in this 21st century, because I could just speak
Absolutely.
for myself as a woman who leads an organization in a male dominated field. It's sometimes very interesting if people don't know how to interact with a
Yeah.
woman that's not, that they feel that might be their equal in a sense, because they've always
Yeah.
held women in a particular position. And so it's important, I think, for men to understand how to interact with women that on a non-romantic level, and just to have a friendship, whether they're married or single, because you're going to have to interact with these women because they're in power. So it's not like, the 50s and 60s where the men went to work and the women stayed home. So they would never have to have meetings with with
Absolutely.
women, but this is a different day. So you have to navigate that space, be able to do it with character and integrity, and still not be weird. Um, and I think important
Say it
for
again, Lisa. You can't be weird. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
so I think that's important. What would you encourage the men that are watching that don't necessarily know how to interact with women? Because I know you told the story to me earlier about how one of the sisters was like, "Oh, do you like hate me or something?" And then you had to
Yeah.
grow into navigating that space in a better way.
No, absolutely. So I just kind of bought into the Franklin Graham, I mean, into the Billy Graham rule that says you never interact with a female. And I think what happens is you don't know how to give, you don't know how to be around a woman beyond being married to her. And really what it does, at least, it is undermines what Paul talks about when he says treat older men like a father, rebuke them gently, treat older women like a mother, and then treat women with purity as if they're your sisters, right? And I think what it happens is that we don't have enough practice with those things, and we find ourselves in situations where when we do come into contact with a person, we've so embraced these cultural narratives that are anti-biblical that we don't know just how to be family, be cool, have a good rapport. What does it look like? And so it actually causes us to be panicked in those situations. We really should not necessarily have a panic, but have appropriate boundaries within it. And so what I've had to learn through the times is that I need to figure out what does it look like to be around my sisters in Christ without becoming this weird ordeal, or I have to have my wife sitting directly next to me, and the only way I can talk to you is because she's sitting there in the situation. But again, it's creating the appropriate boundaries and saying, I'm already in a covenant commitment. I'm literally engaging you as my sister. I'm not crossing the boundaries. And then we have to figure out what it looks like to love one another in a platonic way and not necessarily grow the muscle of the romantic love. And I think that's probably one of the downsides for us is that we've only taught one gear of love.
Mhm.
That the gear of love that we've taught is explicitly romantic. It's not platonic. And you have to model out what platonic friendship looks like to where I can honor you as my sister without crossing the boundaries of being interested in you and wanting to be more than just, your brother in Christ, right? And because we haven't seen a lot of that, oftentimes many of us struggle with the notion of just being friends, just loving on a person, knowing when to pull back, knowing when to push forward, knowing when to speak into a person's life. And because of that, our family dynamic is off. And so what I would say is, if you don't really feel comfortable talking to, sisters in Christ, I would say you're missing a family dynamic. Is that my sisters need me? They need me to speak into the situation. They need me to love on them, and then vice versa. I need them, and I would say verse wise, Jesus says something very amazing in Matthew 22. They're asking this guy, you know, if this person dies and this person dies and this person dies, whose wife will she be? And this is what Jesus says. Jesus said, "You maybe you don't know the scriptures." He says, "But in heaven, we will not. You'll be like the angels. There'll be no marriage, right? That you'll literally be able to love one another in a way that reflects this universal love, not necessarily just this covenant love to one person." And he's highlighting this idea of being brothers and sisters and this whole idea of what that looks like on an eternal spectrum, not necessarily just the romantic love. And so, what I think he's pushing at in that is that, man, we need to have the spectrum that includes the platonic love that we have as sincerely as a brother and sister, not just as a romantic love that we have for one another.
And Jesus
So
modeled that. He had women around him all the time and still,
all the time.
yeah, and treated them as sisters and was able to
Yep.
have healthy relationships. So if we look at Jesus, we could see that. And in a sense, if we're not able to do that, we're not modeling our Savior.
Absolutely.
So I think that's important. For those who are listening and feel like because I know in the Christian world, we push marriage. It's so hard that sometimes people that are single don't feel like they're a whole person unless they're married to another person, or they're less than. And I think it's really important because we focus on Jesus and Paul, who were both, those are our heroes in scripture, and they were both single. So for single people who are really struggling, and not because they aren't married, and they may feel less than, and they feel like they can't do up their identity and purpose until they're married, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say know that you're enough. There's a lot of blogs, there's a lot of conferences that really emphasize the idea of that you're enough. But I think you need to embrace that. It's very difficult because we think that once we arrive to a certain status, that means that we're enough, right? Jesus gave this thing. He says that they went out and drove out demons, and they went and did perform miracles. And he says, don't put your stock in that. Put your stock in the fact that your name is written in the book of life, right? And I think that's difficult because we always look at what we do and not who we are. And if he has made us enough, then we don't have to go out and do more in order to be accepted. We don't have to do more in order to be loved. And we don't have to do more in order to have value. That we already have worth, and we already have value, and we already have love, simply because of what he's already done for us. And so what I would encourage people is, despite the cultural narrative, is that you already have worth, you already have value, you already have love, and you need to fight to understand what that means. Because the more you understand what that means, the more you'll be able to live confidently in that, right? But I would also challenge those who are engaged or married or dating, that there's a level of responsibility that you now have, because now you've entered into a new space where God is trying to change you through another person. He's not just trying to change you through suffering. He's not just trying to change you through trial. He's not just trying to change you through sanctification. He's changing you through a direct relationship with a person that you're in covenant commitment with. And that relationship is to kind of become the warning sign of his relationship with you, right? And so that's kind of the thing, is that there's this new school of thought that says, well, we're all equal. These things are kind of the same. Well, they're not the same. If you're married, there's a different type of sanctification that you endure. If you're single, there's a different type of sanctification that you endure. But the endurance and the marriage and the endurance and the singleness ultimately is to bring you to the Lord. That's the end goal. That's the punchline. The punchline is, do you look more like Jesus? The punchline isn't whether or not you're married or whether or not you're single. But they're two different type of endurances, and they're two different types of sanctification. And so I'll say, for those of us who are single, know that God has not forgotten you. Know that God is listening to you. Know that God doesn't see you as lesser than somebody who is in a covenant relationship. But also recognize that once you get married, he brings a different type of dynamic. He brings a different type of circumstance. He brings a different type of sanctification, simply because he's using a physical, visible person that allows you to see yourself in a way that you could not necessarily have seen had you been single. Mm-hmm. So that's what I would say to those who are single and those who are married.
Amen. Tell our listeners a little bit about how they could get your conference at their churches, the Build a Better Us conference, and also how they could get in contact with you personally.
Absolutely. If you go to buildabetterus.com, we do events and we do small groups. We do an event called Pursuing Extraordinary, which is a 1 to 2 day event where we ultimately overview the idea of marriage and relationship and family, and what does it look like, and what's it like to be mature and progressing in this idea of being married. If you hit me up at BJ116 on Twitter, or you can go to BJ Thompson on Facebook, you can find me and connect with me. And what I would say is this: our role is to help develop people who change the world. And when I say that, I mean worldview transformation, not behavior modification, that allows you to experience life in a way that maybe you've never experienced it before, so that you can impact everything that you touch and come in contact with. So absolutely.
That's awesome. And for those who are watching and say, what does this have to do with apologetics? We usually go in depth with the orthodoxy, but I think I'm very passionate about us being able to practice the scriptures. And if you can't love who you're with, if you can't love your friends, if you can't love your family, then you might have to push pause on being able to recite all the right information and go actually practice it, because that's going to be a better defense for the Christian faith.
Absolutely.
BJ, for your time, I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.